welcome back to the Brambleberry channel. My name's London and I'm the founder of an indie candle and fragrance brand called Particle Goods. If you've watched some of our previous candle making videos, you've probably seen me in those too. But I'm really excited to be back in the studio today so that I can show you how to make colorful layers in your candles at home. If you haven't made a candle before, I recommend going back and watching our How to Make a Candle video. We're gonna link to that video in the show notes. It's just a really great basic video to start off with. We'll talk about things like selecting the right wick, how to choose a container, what wax you should use, all of those essentials. Before you come and do this project, I highly recommend making at least one candle first. But once you've watched that video, feel free to come back and join us for this project. Color is a really fun way to add some personality or customization to your project. And if you're not sure how to add color to your candle, we made a video for that as well called How to Add Color. Again, we're gonna link that down in the show notes below. So feel free to give that a refresh. Today we're gonna be making this really cute green ombre candle. I love the gradients of layers, and we're gonna do that alongside using our brand new Brambleberry fragrance called Frosted Fir. This fragrance smells so yummy. It's got this like fresh forest, fallen snow, freshly chopped wood combination that is obviously amazing for the holidays, but would be awesome all year round too. If you like a Pacific Northwest fragrance like I do, like you're gonna use this no matter what season it is. So today we're gonna add on to all of the techniques we talked about in our How to Add Color video, and we're gonna be using the Brambleberry Dye Flakes from brambleberry.com. This is my favorite way to add color to a candle. I find that the dye flakes are so easy to use. You really get a strong color just by dropping a little small pinch of those dye flakes in, and it's just gonna disperse really evenly. I've tried other types of dyes in the past, including liquid dye and dye blocks, and I've always had a really hard time getting them to incorporate, so I love these. If you remember our succulent candle project, we also used the same color, the sage green dye flakes, and that's what we're gonna use today to create this gradient or ombre candle effect. So we're gonna use one color, and then we're just gonna use varying amounts of that to create each of these three layers. If you wanna change the shade or the tone or the depth of it, feel free to mix your dye flakes together. You can buy small samples of those before you buy this big guy on Brambleberry as well. So the first thing we need to do is get our wax melting in the double boiler. I've got that set up here, and I've also pre-measured out the wax. So I'm using a combination today of both soy and coconut wax. So this is about 70% soy wax and 30% coconut wax, and we'll put those exact measurements for this specific project in the show notes as well. The reason that I used a little bit of coconut wax in this is because that bright white color that it has really makes the color of the dye pop. And it also kind of subdues some of the aesthetic effects that soy can have, such as poor glass adhesion or frosting. If you just have soy at home or you prefer to work with soy, that's totally fine. You can make this exactly as is with pure soy wax. Now, the first layer that we're doing, we're gonna do the darkest layer, and I wanna add my dye flakes into my wax while it's melting. And I'm gonna use about a half a teaspoon of dye flakes. And I say about because they're really hard to measure. We're gonna do our best. I'm just gonna scoop out a loose half teaspoon and put that into my melting pot. So I've stirred in my sage green dye flakes for that first layer. And don't be too worried about the color. I know it's hard to tell what it looks like when it's melted. It's gonna be much darker than it is when it's cool, but I'm gonna show you how to test for that. First, we wanna let that fully melt so we can test the color. We can always add more. So as with anything, if you're worried about something being too dark, don't add the full amount, add it in small increments, and you can always add more as you go. While my wax is melting and getting up to that full 185-degree temperature, I'm just gonna go ahead and prep everything else. So I'm gonna start by prepping my wicks. Today I'm using the narrow, short wooden wick. And then I'm also using the 4-ounce glass lidded jar. I've taken the lids off so they're ready to go. I love that these wicks are like the perfect size to fit in there, so it's really easy. To assemble your wick, you just slide that wick right into the wick clip. And because the wood wicks are gonna stay rigid in the hot wax, we really don't need to use an adhesive. So I'm not gonna bother with a wick sticker. I know I've talked your ear off about using a wick sticker in the past, but in this case, you can just forgo the wick sticker. And then I like to wait until I've poured that first layer of wax, and then I'll set my wick in. That way the wax will kind of cool around the wick clip and really hold it securely in the center. So those are ready to go. The next thing I want to do is measure out my fragrance. We also want to do that by weight, just like we did with our wax. I've tared out my container and I'm throwing the lid around. You don't have to do that at home. You can skip that part. And I'm going to use about 1/2 ounce, which is going to give us a fragrance load of, I think, between 8 and 9%. I almost always go for about 8%. I found that the throw with this fragrance oil was exceptional. So you could go slightly lower, slightly higher. This was a really easy measurement, and I don't like math, so I wanted to make it easy for you. So I've got everything weighed out, prepped, ready to go. Let's check on our wax, see how it's doing, and we can go ahead and test the color. So I'm just checking the temperature of my wax. Remember, we don't want to let the wax overheat. So overheating happens once you exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and especially where we're using dye, that can cause a lot of discoloration. So we want to be really mindful to heat it up to the right amount, but not too much. And we are at the perfect temperature. We're at 188 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and test my color, make sure that that's good before I pour. To do that, I'm just going to take a piece of paper towel, dip it in, so scientific, and then I'm going to lay that down on just a nonstick surface, parchment paper, tinfoil, baking sheet, whatever you have works really well. And we'll let that cool for just a minute, and that's going to give us a really realistic idea of what that color is going to look like. So we'll know if we need to add more while the wax is still hot, and we want to make sure that we wait to add our fragrance until we know for sure that the wax color is perfect. All right, so I'm really happy with this color. I think that it'll be a nice dark saturated green. So my wax is at the perfect temperature. Like I said, it's about 188. So I want to remove it from the heat source. And then I'm going to add my fragrance in. And then I'm just going to slowly and gently stir that. Again, when you're using dye, there are some other things to keep in mind, like frosting is a big one. So one of the ways to reduce your frosting is to be sure that you don't over agitate at any point while it's cooling. So try to go slow, take your time. Once you've incorporated your fragrance, you want to let your wax cool to about 165 degrees. For this first layer, because it's the darkest and we want to really minimize the possibility that that frosts. So I'm going to let this cool, and then we'll come back and we'll pour into our containers. So our wax is at 165, which is the perfect pouring temperature for the first layer. So what I want to do is make sure that I get really precise measurements. And when I say precise, I mean like as precise-ish as you can, because I'm not a precise person. But I'm going to put this 4-ounce glass jar on the scale, tear the weight out, which just means we zero it out so that we're not counting the weight of the jar. And I'm going to use that to pour into. I think I'm pouring about 1.5 ounces into each container for this first layer. I'm going to try to go really slow and pour directly into the center so that I don't have any wax that drips down the side. If you do, it's okay, but just try your best. Well, see, I got some there. Do as I say and not as I do. You can see why not having that wick in the center is really helpful for that first pour. Perfect. And I'm just going to add a tiny bit to this one. I always like to use just a little extra than what I need. That way, if you have to go back and add something, you have a little wax left over. So I'm gonna let these guys sit for a few minutes before I put the wick in there, just to allow the bottom to just start to solidify just enough so that it'll hold that wick. If I drop them in right away, the wax is still really hot and they have a tendency to just kind of slide around because the bottom of those containers have kind of a domed effect. So we'll give it just a second and then we'll put our wicks in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and place my wicks. I'm just gonna try to carefully kind of press down in the center. The wax should be set enough that it'll kind of stick to the bottom. And if it moves a little bit, just adjust it. These are pretty forgiving. This guy's a runner. He's trying to go to the side. All right, so now that our wicks are placed, we're just gonna let this cool. We wanna make sure that this layer is completely cool and opaque before we add the second layer. Otherwise, you're gonna get blending and it's just gonna get really muddy. I think in testing, it took about a half hour to 45 minutes to let this completely cool. It might vary depending on the pouring temperature that you used or your wax or the ambient temperature of your room. This is a good time to just like go eat a snack or watch something on Netflix for 20 or 30 minutes. And definitely avoid the temptation to put it in the refrigerator or worse, in the freezer. I know that it's really tempting to just like pop it in there and you wanna see that color like come through right away. But I promise if you do that, it's definitely gonna cause poor glass adhesion. That wax is gonna shrink really quickly and it's gonna interfere with the crystalline structure of that wax. So you wanna make sure it cools really, really slowly, can create a really nice chain, and that's gonna give you a really smooth look. So the frosting happens when you cool things too quickly or unevenly, so make sure you don't try to speed it up, just let it sit out at room temperature, and I'll see you back in a few minutes. Okay, we waited, our patience was rewarded, and our layers look beautiful. You can see that they've fully set up, which means that we can now add another layer on top. So I've already measured out my wax, that's melting in the double boiler. Same steps as we did before, same wax measurements as we did before. The only thing different with this layer is gonna be the amount of dye flake that we use and the pouring temperature. So for the dye flakes, my recommendation is if you want that really blended ombre effect and you wanna make sure that those layers look different, use half of the amount as you did in the previous layer. So the first layer was half a teaspoon. That means this layer is gonna be a quarter teaspoon. So again, trying to make that math easy for you. And repeating the rules as well, you can always add more. So if you're afraid that it's gonna be too dark, you can set a couple of dye flakes aside and just add a little bit at one time. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop that in. And then just like before, we're gonna stir. Make sure that those dye flakes get to melt. Oh, come on. You gotta stick to it. So we still wanna make sure that our wax heats up to 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Even though we're gonna pour at a lower temperature, the process of expanding those molecules, adding the fragrance, adding the dye, all of that is the same. So we wanna heat it up to the same temperature, and then we're gonna cool this layer down to about 145 before we pour. And that's just so that it's not so hot that it breaks through the top of this first layer or creates too muddy of a line in between. We want those really crisp layers. So that should be about perfect. All right, so our wax is almost to the right temperature, so a good time to check the color and make sure that we like it, see if we need to add any more dye flakes. So repeat that same test we did before. Dip our paper towel in there, and I'm gonna set it next to the first one so that as it cools, I can really compare side by side and make sure that that's gonna be the perfect color. So my color test looks good. I think that's gonna be the perfect color. I've taken my wax off of the heat source, added my fragrance, stirred that in, and I've waited until the temperature dropped down to 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're ready to pour. Same process as last time. We're gonna put this guy on the scale, tear it out so that we can measure those layers as precisely as possible. Now this time we have the wick to contend with, so you're gonna have to figure out what works best for you to just try to pour to the side without getting it all down the edge. I'll do my best to demonstrate, no promises. All right, time to get another snack. Watch another episode on Netflix or Hulu, whatever you want to do. But make sure that you let these cool just as you did with the first layer. We want to make sure that that is fully opaque before we come back and add the third layer. See you shortly. All right, I hope your snack was really good. Our second layer is fully cool. You can see the lovely contrast between those two. And it's time for the final layer. So the last step is exactly like the first and second step, except we're going to have the dye flakes again. Now, I happen to have a 1/8 teaspoon. This is the first time I've seen one. I didn't know that they existed. So you may or may not have one at home. If you don't, that's okay. If you do, use this. If you don't, I'll show you what to do. Use your 1/4 teaspoon. Try to get some of the same kind of loose measurement as you did last time. Dump it in a little pile and just sort it in half. Use your eyeballs as best you can with this layer, because I always want it to be as light as it can be so that it gives that extra little bit of contrast. I'm not going to add the full 1/8 teaspoon. I'm going to add about half of it, check it like we had before, and then make sure that it's what I want before I add the rest. All right, let's do that. The final pinch. Da-na-na-na. All right, I went ahead and did our final color test, and I think that that looks like a really nice shade. I'm not gonna add any more dye flakes. So I'm gonna let this cool, get it to the right temperature, and then we'll go ahead and pour. You can use the scale, you can eyeball it for the last one, whatever you feel comfortable doing. I'm gonna use the scale because I like to be consistent. All right, one last time, tear out your scale. Let's pour the final layer. That one's gonna be a hot mess.
Always one.
I know. That's the one I had poured some of the wax out to test the color, and I poured too much, and so then I didn't have enough to finish the layer,
Right.
and I had to heat up more and finish the layer.
Yeah.
So I knew that one was gonna be,
The dud.
yeah. All right, that's it. You poured the final layer. We're just gonna let those sit and cool. I would leave them unmoved probably for about 48 hours before they're gonna be ready to burn. So once your candle has cured for a full 48 hours, it's ready to burn. Remember, proper candle care is to first trim that wick to about 1/4 of an inch. This neck on the glass jar is a little bit narrow, so it's kind of tricky to get scissors in there. So my best suggestion is to use some nail trimmers. Not your quarantine nail trimmers, get a fresh pair, but that'll work really well. Make sure you can go straight across so that you have a nice even burn. I love the look of these candles. I know that layering is a little more time consuming, takes a little more practice. It's definitely more math. I had to recheck my measurements a couple of times, which just means that even an experienced candle maker can always use a little practice. Math usually needs a second look for me anyway, but I like the look of these, and even if you decide to do a different color scheme, what an amazing holiday gift, right? Like perfect size. These come with a lid, so once you've trimmed the wick, you can just pop the lid right on wrap it up. And during this season, I just think any small gift that you can give is such a powerful statement that even if we're not together, we can still be connected. So make sure you use a clear jar so you can see those beautiful layers. If you make a project, I want to see what it looks like. So be sure to tag Brambleberry in your post so that we can see it and share it. And if you like this video, make sure that you like and subscribe to the YouTube channel where you can get more videos and projects from experts like me. And until then, we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.